This is A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell, Part 2, with the same incentive as previously mentioned before in a video previously before this, and before that, I mentioned the incentive that correlated with the video that I just referred to, that came after the video that I just referred to. For a moment, Mrs. Hale had no answer. Then, well, I guess John Wright didn't wake up. When they was slipping that rope under his neck, she muttered. No, it's strange, breathed Mr. Peters. They think it was such a funny way to kill a man. She began to laugh. At a sound of the laugh, abruptly stopped. At sound of the laugh, abruptly stopped. That's just what Mr. Hale said Mrs. Hale, in a resolutely natural voice. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand. Mrs. Henderson said, coming out, that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling. Well, I don't see any Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here, said Mrs. Hale. I don't. She stopped. It was as if her mind tripped on something. Her eye was caught by a dish towel in the middle of the kitchen. Slowly, she moved toward the table. One half of it was wiped clean, the other half messy. Her eyes made a slow, almost unwilling turn to the bucket of sugar and the half-empty bag beside it. This begun, and not finished. After a moment, she stepped back and said, in that manner of releasing herself, "Wonder how they're finding. Wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had a little more red up there. You know." She paused, and feeling gathered, "It seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and coming out here to get her own house to turn against her." But Mrs. Hale said nothing. But Mrs. Hale said the sheriff's wife. This is said the sheriff's wife. This the law. The law is the law. I suppose it is, answered Mrs. Hale shortly. She turned to the stove, saying something about that fire not being much to drag of. She worked with it a minute, and when she straightened up, she said aggressively, "The law is the law, and a bad stove is a bad stove. How do you like to cook on this?" Pointing with poker to the broken lining. She opened the oven door and started to express her opinion of the oven. She opened, but she was swept into her own thoughts, thinking of what it would mean year after year to have that stove to wrestle with. The thought of Minnie Foster trying to bake in that oven, and the thought of her never going out over to see Minnie Foster. She was startled by hearing Mrs. Peters say, "A person gets discouraged and loses heart." The sheriff's wife had looked from the stove to the sink to the pail of water which had been carried in from outside. The two women stood there silent. Above them, footsteps of the men who were looking for evidence against the woman who had worked in that kitchen. That look of seeing into things, of seeing through a lining to something else, was in the eyes of the sheriff's wife now. When Mrs. Hale next spoke to her, it was gently. "Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. We will not we will not feel them when we go out." Mrs. Peters went back to the room to hang up the fur tippet she was wearing. Tippet. A moment later, she exclaimed, "Why, she was piecing a quilt," and held up a large sewing basket piled with high quilt pieces. Mrs. Hale spread some of the blocks on the table. "It's logging cabin pattern," she said, putting several of them together. "Pretty, isn't it?" They were so engaged with the quilt that they did not hear footsteps on the stairs. They did not hear the footsteps on the stairs. Just as the stair door opened, Mrs. Hale was saying, "Do you suppose she was going to quilt it or just nod it?" The sheriff threw up his hands. They wonder whether she was going to quilt it or just nod it. There was a laugh for the ways of woman, a warming of hands over the stove, and then the country attorney said briskly, "Well, let's go right out to the barn and get that cleared up." "I don't see as there's anything so strange," Mrs. Hale said resentfully, after the outside door had closed on the three men. Our taking our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see it as it's anything to laugh about. Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds," said the sheriff's wife apologetically. They returned they returned to an inspection of the block for the quilt. Mrs. Hale was looking at the fine, even sewing and preoccupied with thoughts of the woman who had done that sewing. When she heard the sheriff's wife say, in a queer tone, "Why, look at this one," she turned to take the block held out to her. "The sewing," said Mrs. Peters in a troubled way. "All the rest of them have been so nice and even, but this one. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about." Their eyes met. Something flashed to life, passed between them. Then, as if in effort, she seemed to pull away from each other. A moment, Mrs. Hale sat there, her hand folded over the sewing, which was so unlike all the rest of the sewing. She had pulled a knot and drawn the threads. "Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?" asked the sheriff's wife, startled. Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good," said Mrs. Hale mildly. "I don't think we ought to touch things," Mrs. Peters said, a little helplessly. "I'll just finish up this end," answered Mrs. Hale, still in that mild, matter-of-fact fashion. She threaded a needle and started to replace bad sewing with good. For a little while she sewed in silence. Then, in that thin, timid voice, she heard Mrs. Hale. "Yes, Mrs. Peters." "What do you suppose she was so nervous about?" "Oh, don't know," said Mrs. Hale, as if dismissing a thing not important enough to spend much time on. I don't know as she was nervous. I sew awful queer sometimes when I'm just tired." She cut a thread, and out of the corner of her eye looked up at Mrs. Peters. The small, lean face of the sheriff's wife seemed to have tightened up. Her eyes had her eyes had that look of peering into something. But next moment she moved, and she and said in her thin, indecisive way, "Well, I must get those clothes wrapped. They must be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I could find a piece of paper and string." "In that cupboard, maybe," suggested Mrs. Hale after a glance around. One piece of crazy sewing remained unripped. Mrs. Peters' back turned. Martha Hale now scrutinized that piece, compared it with the dainty, accurate sewing of the other blocks. The difference was startling. Holding this block made her feel queer, as if the distracted thoughts of the woman who had perhaps turned to it try and were communicating themselves to her. Mrs. Peters's voice roused her. "Here's a bird cage," she said. "Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?" "Why, I don't know whether she did or not." She looked at the cage Mrs. Peters was holding. "I've not been here in so long," she sighed. There's a man round last year selling canaries cheap. but I don't know as she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing really pretty herself. Mrs. Peters looked around the kitchen. Seems kind of funny to think of a bird here. She half laughed, an attempt to put a barrier. But she but she must have had one. Or why would she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it. I suppose maybe the cat got to it, suggested Mrs. Hale, resuming her sewing. No, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. When they brought her to when they brought her to our house yesterday, my cat got in the room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out. My sister Bessie was like that, laughed Mrs. Hale. The sheriff's wife did not reply. The silence made Mrs. Hale turn around. Mrs. Peters was examining the birdcage. Look at this door, she said slowly. It's broke. One hinge been pulled out apart. Mrs. Hale came nearer. Look as if someone must have been rough with it. Again their eyes met, startled, questioning, apprehensive. For a moment neither spoke nor stirred. Then Mrs. Hale, turning away, said brusquely, if they're going to find any evidence, I wish they'd be about it. I don't like this place. But I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Peters put the birdcage on the table and sat down. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone. Yes, it would, wouldn't it? Agreed Mrs. Hale, a certain determined naturalness in her voice.